"She's worthless," Jason Reed said, his voice smooth, almost bored, like he was commenting on the weather rather than dismantling a person's existence. And for a moment, the entire boardroom seemed to hold its breath as the word echoed against glass walls and polished steel, settling into the silence like a verdict no one dared challenge. Evelyn Carter didn't flinch, not visibly, though her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the slim leather folder she held against her side, the only sign that the word had landed somewhere deeper than she would ever allow them to see. And under the cold LED lights of the 32nd floor, with the skyline of Manhattan stretching endlessly beyond the windows, she looked smaller than the room wanted her to be, dressed in a simple navy sheath that whispered restraint in a place that screamed power. While across the table, Jason leaned back in his chair like he owned not just the company but the air itself, his tailored suit sharp, his expression sharper, a faint smile tugging at his lips as a few muted chuckles rippled through the executives seated beside him. People who once knew her name, who once shook her hand with respect, now avoiding her eyes as if proximity to her might cost them something. The projector hummed softly, casting charts and quarterly projections across the wall, but no one was really looking at the numbers anymore, because the real performance was unfolding at the head of the table, where Jason had turned what should have been a routine meeting into something else entirely, something personal, and Evelyn could feel it in the way the room shifted, in the subtle lean of bodies toward him, in the way silence stretched just a second too long after he spoke, as if everyone was waiting for her to react, to defend herself, to give them something they could label as weakness. But she didn't. She simply lifted her gaze, steady and unreadable, meeting his eyes for the first time since she had walked into the building that morning. And for a flicker of a second, so brief it could have been imagined, something in his expression tightened, like a hairline crack beneath a flawless surface, before the arrogance settled back into place, thicker than before. "We need people who actually add value," he continued, tapping his pen lightly against the table, the sound sharp. "In the quiet, not placeholders." And the word hung there, softer than worthless, but somehow more cutting, because it carried dismissal, erasure, the suggestion that she had never truly mattered. And somewhere near the end of the table, someone shifted uncomfortably, a chair leg scraping faintly against the floor, the only protest the room would offer. Evelyn inhaled slowly, the scent of expensive cologne and polished wood filling her lungs, grounding her in the present moment, because she had learned, over months that felt like years, that survival wasn't about speaking louder. It was about choosing when not to speak at all. And as Jason turned his attention back to the screen, already moving on as if he had said nothing extraordinary, as if he hadn't just reduced a person to nothing in front of an audience, she allowed herself the smallest exhale, a quiet release that no one noticed. No one except perhaps the man at the far end of the table who watched her a second longer than necessary, curiosity flickering behind his composed demeanor. But even that passed, swallowed by the rhythm of business as usual, and the meeting resumed. Numbers and forecasts filling the space where humiliation had just been laid bare, yet beneath it all, beneath the calm surface she wore like armor, something had shifted, not broken, not this time, because the word worthless didn't echo the way it used to. It didn't define her, not anymore, and though no one in that room could have known it, though Jason certainly didn't, the balance of power they believed was fixed had already begun to tilt, quietly, invisibly, toward a truth that had yet to be spoken aloud, a truth that would not need raised voices or dramatic declarations, because when it arrived, it would arrive in silence, and it would change everything. The meeting moved on, but the air never quite settled, as if something invisible had been disturbed and refused to return to its place. And Evelyn Carter remained exactly where she was, seated midway down the long conference table, her posture straight, her expression composed, while the executives around her resumed their quiet notes and calculated nods, pretending that nothing unusual had just happened, pretending that the word he had used had not carved itself into the room. The presentation shifted to projections for the next fiscal quarter, numbers climbing and dipping in neat, predictable patterns across the screen. But Evelyn's focus was not on the figures. It was on the rhythm of the room, the subtle choreography of power that had once been second nature to her. The way Jason Reed controlled the tempo with a glance, The way people leaned in when he spoke and leaned away when he dismissed, and she remembered, with a clarity that felt almost distant, that there had been a time when she sat at the head of this same table, when her voice carried weight, when decisions were not performances but outcomes shaped by her own steady hand. A quiet flicker of memory surfaced, not sharp enough to distract her, just enough to remind her of who she had been before everything had been rewritten, before her name had been quietly removed from documents, from conversations, from the company itself, as if she had never existed. And yet here she was, back in the room that had once been hers, not as a ghost, not as a visitor, but as something far more deliberate. Jason's voice cut through her thoughts again, confident, assured, explaining a strategy that sounded polished but hollow to ears that understood the foundation beneath it. And Evelyn noted the small inconsistencies, the overpromises, the subtle strain behind his composure that no one else seemed to notice, because they were still looking at him the way they always had, as if he were untouchable, as if his version of the story had become the only one that mattered. She lowered her gaze briefly to the folder in her hands, her thumb brushing along the edge of the paper inside. A simple gesture that grounded her, because inside that folder was not just data or projections. It was something far quieter and far more decisive, something that did not need to be announced yet, something that would speak for itself when the moment came. And as she lifted her eyes again, she caught the reflection of the city in the glass wall, the skyline stretching endlessly, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding inside this room, and it reminded her of the months she had spent rebuilding in silence, far from this place, where no one watched and no one judged, where every step forward had been hers alone. A soft murmur rippled through the table as one of the senior partners asked a question, his tone cautious, probing just enough to test the edges of Jason's plan, and for a fraction of a second Jason hesitated, the pause so slight it could have been missed, but Evelyn saw it, the crack beneath the surface, the moment where certainty faltered, and then it was gone, replaced by a smooth answer that satisfied the room, drawing approving nods and a few quiet notes of agreement. The illusion restored. Evelyn did not react. She did not shift. She simply observed, because she had learned that true power did not rush to prove itself. It waited, it gathered, it moved when no one expected it. And as the meeting continued, as voices rose and fell and decisions were outlined with practiced precision, she felt a calm settle over her, deeper than confidence, steadier than resolve, because this time she was not here to reclaim what had been taken. She was here for something else entirely, something no one in that room had yet realized. And as Jason leaned forward to conclude his segment, his voice carrying that same easy authority, he did not look at her again, not once, because in his mind she was already dismissed, already insignificant, already gone, and that was exactly why he would never see it coming. The meeting dissolved not with a bang, but with the quiet shuffle of leather chairs and closing folders, the kind of controlled ending that made it seem as though nothing significant had happened, and yet the tension lingered in the air like a scent that refused to fade, subtle but unmistakable, as executives gathered their notes and exchanged low conversations that hovered just above a whisper. Evelyn Carter remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, allowing the room to empty around her, watching as people avoided her gaze with polite efficiency, their attention sliding past her as if she were part of the furniture rather than someone who had once signed their paychecks. And she recognized that look, that careful distance, because she had seen it before, back when the narrative had shifted against her and staying close had become a liability. She rose slowly, smoothing an invisible crease from her dress, her movements deliberate, controlled, every gesture measured in a way that suggested not hesitation but restraint. And as she stepped away from the table, she caught fragments of conversation drifting through the room, pieces of sentences that carried more meaning than the speakers intended. "I heard she is just here temporarily," one voice murmured, followed by a quiet, almost sympathetic reply. "It is unfortunate how things turned out." And Evelyn let the words pass through her without reaction, because they were not new. They were echoes of a story that had been told too many times, shaped and reshaped until it barely resembled the truth. Near the glass wall, Jason Reed stood surrounded by a small circle of executives, his posture relaxed, his confidence effortless as he spoke in low, assured tones, already shifting the conversation toward upcoming deals and future growth, as if the meeting had only reinforced his position rather than exposed the faintest hint of instability beneath it. And when someone made a light comment that drew a ripple of laughter, he smiled in that familiar way, the one that suggested control, the one that had once convinced everyone, including Evelyn, that he was always one step ahead. She moved toward the door, her heels quiet against the polished floor, and for a brief moment their paths aligned, not directly, not in a way that would force acknowledgement, but close enough that she could hear the cadence of his voice without turning her head, and she felt it then, not anger, not even resentment, but something far steadier, a clarity that had taken months to build, because she understood now that his confidence depended on a version of reality that no longer existed, a version where she was gone, erased, irrelevant. As she reached the hallway, the atmosphere shifted, the controlled intensity of the boardroom giving way to the softer hum of the office beyond, where employees moved between desks and glass-walled offices, carrying coffee cups and tablets, their conversations lighter, unaware of the quiet fracture that had begun upstairs. And a few glanced at her as she passed, curiosity flickering behind professional smiles, as if trying to place her, as if sensing that she belonged and yet did not. And Evelyn continued forward without breaking stride, her reflection appearing and disappearing in the glass panels along the corridor, a series of fleeting images that felt almost symbolic, like fragments of a past identity she no longer needed to carry. At the far end of the hall, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside, the space empty, enclosed, a brief moment of stillness away from watching eyes. And as the door slid shut, she allowed her shoulders to relax by the smallest degree, not enough to be visible, just enough to release the tension she had held in place since the meeting began, and her gaze dropped to the folder in her hands once more, the weight of it grounding, familiar, because within those pages lay decisions already made, agreements already signed, a future already set into motion long before she walked back into that building. The elevator began its descent, numbers lighting up one by one, steady and inevitable, and Evelyn watched them without expression, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored wall, composed, unreadable, a woman who no longer needed validation from the room she had just left, and somewhere above, behind glass and steel and quiet conversations, Jason continued as if nothing had changed, as if the foundation beneath him remained untouched, and that was the only reason he would not recognize the shift until it was too late. The elevator doors opened into the quiet marble lobby, and for a brief moment the world seemed slower here, removed from the sharp edges of the boardroom above, where decisions were made and clipped voices and reputations were dismantled with casual precision, and Evelyn Carter stepped forward into the softer light, her heels echoing faintly across the polished floor as she moved past the reception desk where a young assistant glanced up, her expression shifting from routine politeness to a flicker of recognition she could not quite place, as if Evelyn existed somewhere between familiarity and rumor. Outside, the late morning air carried the distant hum of the city, taxis sliding past in steady streams, the rhythm of Manhattan uninterrupted by the small battles unfolding inside glass towers. And Evelyn paused for just a second at the base of the building, not to hesitate, but to breathe, to let the noise of the street settle into something grounding, something real, because unlike the curated atmosphere upstairs, this was a place that did not pretend. She adjusted the strap of her bag and began to walk, blending into the current of people moving along the sidewalk, each absorbed in their own urgency, their own destinations, none of them aware that the woman passing among them carried a quiet shift in power that had yet to be revealed. And as she moved, her mind drifted not backward in regret, but sideways into memory, to a version of this same street years earlier, when she had walked beside Jason Reed, when the future had felt like something they were building together rather than something he would later claim as his own. She could still recall the way he used to talk about the company in those early days, not with arrogance, but with hunger, ambition wrapped in charm, the promise of something bigger than both of them. And she had believed in that promise, had poured herself into it with a kind of loyalty that now felt almost foreign, not because it was misplaced, but because it had been taken for granted, reshaped into a narrative where her contributions faded conveniently into the background. A black sedan rolled to a smooth stop at the curb beside her, interrupting the flow of her thoughts. Its presence subtle but deliberate, and the driver stepped out with practiced efficiency, opening the rear door without a word. And for a passerby, it might have looked like coincidence, like any other car arriving for any other passenger. But Evelyn did not hesitate, did not question. She simply stepped forward and slid into the seat as if it had always been waiting for her. The interior was quiet, insulated from the city's noise, the faint scent of leather and something clean and understated filling the space. And as the door closed behind her, the outside world softened into a distant blur, replaced by a stillness that felt intentional, controlled, and she allowed herself to lean back slightly, her gaze shifting to the tablet resting on the seat beside her, its screen already illuminated with a series of documents that mirrored the contents of the folder she still held, but expanded, finalized, undeniable. Her reflection appeared faintly in the darkened window as the car pulled away from the curb, the building receding behind her, growing smaller with each passing second. And for the first time since she had stepped into that boardroom, a subtle change touched her expression, not a smile, not triumph, but something quieter, something steadier, because she understood now that the humiliation she had endured was not a setback. It was positioning, a final confirmation that no one there saw her clearly enough to anticipate what was coming. And as the car merged into traffic, disappearing into the endless movement of the city, the distance between who they believed she was and who she had become stretched wider with every block, until it was no longer a gap that could be bridged, but a divide that would soon be revealed in a way none of them were prepared to face. The car moved through midtown traffic with quiet precision, the city unfolding outside in reflections of glass and steel, but inside the cabin everything felt contained, deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to match the steady rhythm of Evelyn Carter's breathing. And she reached for the tablet beside her, her fingers brushing the edge before lifting it with the same controlled ease she had carried through the boardroom, the screen illuminating her face with a cool glow as rows of figures, legal confirmations, and finalized agreements scrolled beneath her gaze, each line a quiet testament to decisions made far from the noise of that company, far from Jason Reed's assumptions. And she did not rush through them, did not skim, because she knew every number, every clause, every signature by memory, having traced them back step by step over months that had required patience more than anything else. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, the faint vibration barely registering within the insulated space, and Evelyn leaned back slightly, her eyes lifting from the screen to the passing city, where people hurried along sidewalks with coffee cups and briefcases, unaware of the invisible transactions shaping the structures above them, unaware that ownership could change hands without a single headline, without a single raised voice. And she thought of the word Jason had used, not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with a kind of detached clarity, as if it belonged to a different version of her, someone who no longer existed in the way he believed. Her thumb tapped lightly against the tablet, opening a final document, one that required no revision, no negotiation, only acknowledgement. And at the bottom of the page her name appeared again, not erased, not minimized, but formal, complete, positioned where it could not be ignored. And for a moment, she let her gaze rest there, not in pride, but in recognition of the distance she had traveled to place it back into a space where it carried weight. The driver adjusted the route with a subtle turn, the skyline shifting as the car moved toward a quieter stretch of the city, where glass towers gave way to older buildings with polished facades and understated entrances. And Evelyn set the tablet aside, closing it with a soft click that echoed faintly in the stillness, her hand returning to the leather folder resting on her lap, the physical counterpart to everything she had just reviewed. Grounding, tangible, something she could hold even as the larger picture remained invisible to everyone else. Her reflection in the window was faint but steady, a mirror layered over the movement of the city, and she studied it for a second, not to evaluate, but to confirm, because the woman looking back at her was not the one who had once stood beside Jason believing in shared ambition, nor the one who had walked away with nothing but silence and questions. She was something else now, something quieter and far more certain. and as the car slowed to a stop in front of a building that did not announce itself loudly but carried the weight of quiet authority, she did not hesitate. She did not pause. She simply reached for the handle and stepped out. The air cooler here, the noise of the city softened by distance and design. A man in a tailored suit approached with a respectful nod, opening the glass door before she reached it, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with recognition, the kind that did not need to be spoken, and Evelyn stepped inside, her heels crossing the threshold with the same measured cadence, the lobby beyond calm, refined, removed from the performative energy of the company she had just left, and as the door closed behind her, sealing off the outside world, the final piece of the morning settled into place, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of something that had already been decided long before anyone else realized they were part of it. The lobby carried a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself, the kind of space where every detail was intentional, from the soft lighting that reflected off polished stone floors to the low murmur of voices that never rose above a measured tone. And Evelyn Carter moved through it with a familiarity that was not born from habit, but from alignment. As if she belonged to this level of stillness more than the performative chaos she had left behind, her heels marking a steady rhythm as she approached the reception desk where a woman in a tailored blazer offered a composed smile that shifted subtly into recognition the moment their eyes met. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," the receptionist said, her voice calm, respectful, without hesitation. And Evelyn inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, a small gesture that carried more weight than words, before continuing toward the private elevators at the far end of the lobby, where a man was already waiting, his posture straight, his expression professional, and as she approached he pressed a key card against the panel without needing instruction, the elevator doors opening immediately with a soft chime that seemed quieter than the one she had left behind earlier, as if even sound was refined here. Inside, the elevator was lined with dark wood and brushed metal, the air faintly scented with something clean and understated. And as the doors closed, sealing them into a contained silence, the man beside her spoke in a tone that suggested both deference and precision. "Everything has been finalized," he said, not as an update, but as confirmation of something already understood, and Evelyn nodded once, her gaze steady on the rising numbers above the door, each floor bringing her closer to a space where the invisible would begin to take form. The ascent was smooth, uninterrupted, and for a brief moment her mind drifted back to a different kind of elevator, one filled with tension, with whispered judgments and sideways glances, where her presence had been questioned without being spoken aloud, and the contrast settled into her with quiet clarity, not as a comparison, but as a reminder of how far the narrative had shifted without anyone noticing. When the doors opened, the transition was immediate, the atmosphere changing from quiet elegance to something even more exclusive, a private floor where movement was minimal and every detail suggested control, and a small group of individuals stood waiting near a glass-walled conference room, their attention turning toward her with a focus that was direct, unambiguous, and entirely different from the cautious avoidance she had encountered earlier that day. "Miss Carter," one of them said, stepping forward, his tone measured but unmistakably respectful, and he extended a folder toward her, thicker than the one she carried, its contents already familiar, already decided, and she accepted it without breaking stride, her movements seamless, as if this moment had been rehearsed long before it arrived. Inside the conference room, the table was set with precision, documents arranged in exact alignment, pens placed deliberately at each seat, and as she entered, the subtle shift in posture among those present spoke louder than any greeting, a collective recognition of authority that did not need to be declared, and Evelyn took her place at the head of the table without hesitation, setting her folder down with a soft, controlled motion, her fingers resting lightly against its surface as her gaze moved across the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn, not to challenge, not to assert, but to acknowledge a shared understanding that required no explanation. Outside, the city continued its constant motion, unaware, unchanged. But within these walls, something had already shifted into place. Something that had been building quietly beneath the surface of transactions and signatures and decisions made without spectacle. And as the first document was slid toward her, The final formality before everything became official. Evelyn did not rush, did not speak. She simply reached for the pen, her movements precise, deliberate, and in that stillness, in that absence of noise, the future that others believed was still uncertain had already been secured. The pen did not tremble in Evelyn Carter's hand as it touched the paper, the ink flowing in a steady, deliberate line that carried more weight than any words spoken in the boardroom she had left behind. And as her signature formed across the final page, the room remained silent, not out of tension, but out of recognition, because everyone present understood that this was not a negotiation, not a possibility, but a conclusion that had already been reached long before they gathered at this table. She set the pen down with a soft, controlled motion, the faint click echoing against the glass walls, and for a moment no one moved, as if the stillness itself was part of the process, a final acknowledgement of the shift that had just been formalized. And then the man seated to her right inclined his head slightly, his expression composed but unmistakably respectful. "It is done," he said, not as an announcement, but as confirmation of something inevitable, and Evelyn gave a single nod, her gaze calm, her posture unchanged, because there was no need for reaction, no need for visible satisfaction. The result spoke for itself. Documents were gathered with quiet efficiency, folders closed, signatures verified, each movement precise and measured. And as the room began to shift from stillness to motion, Evelyn allowed her attention to drift briefly, not outward, but inward, to the path that had led her here. The months of calculated decisions, the meetings held in rooms far removed from the company she once helped build, the careful acquisition of shares that had gone unnoticed, piece by piece, until the balance had tipped in a way no one had anticipated. And she remembered the moment she had realized it was possible, not as a surge of emotion, but as a quiet clarity, the understanding that power did not need to be reclaimed in the way it had been lost. It could be rebuilt in a form that could not be taken away again. The man across the table slid a finalized document toward her, a formal summary of everything that had just been executed, and as she glanced down at it, her name appeared once more, not in the margins, not as a footnote, but at the center of authority, positioned where it could no longer be erased or rewritten by someone else's narrative. And she closed the folder without lingering, because the significance did not require repetition outside the glass walls. The private floor remained calm, the quiet movement of assistants and advisors continuing with practiced discretion, as if this level of decision-making was simply part of the day's rhythm. And in many ways it was, because here, power was not performed, it was exercised, quietly, consistently, without spectacle, and Evelyn rose from her seat with the same measured composure she had carried into the room, her hands resting briefly on the table before she stepped back, the subtle shift signaling completion more clearly than any declaration. "The board will be informed within the hour," the man beside her said, his tone steady, efficient, and Evelyn inclined her head again, already aware of the sequence that would follow, the calls, the notifications, the sudden recalibration of a structure that believed itself stable. And she knew that when the information reached the 32nd floor, when Jason Reed and the others heard the words spoken in a tone they would not expect, there would be a moment, brief but undeniable, where everything would stop, where the narrative they had relied on would fracture under the weight of a truth they had not seen coming. She stepped toward the door, the room behind her settling back into its quiet order, and as it closed with a soft, final sound, the process was complete, not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the only way that mattered. And as she moved down the corridor, her reflection steady in the glass panels beside her, there was no need to look back, because the past had already been rewritten, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through a series of decisions that had led, step by step, to this exact moment, where silence had done what words never could. The corridor seemed quieter as Evelyn Carter walked through it, not because the building had changed, but because something within her had settled into place, a calm that did not seek validation or recognition. And as she reached the private elevator once more, the man who had accompanied her earlier was already there, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, as if every step of this process had been anticipated down to the smallest detail. and when the doors opened he stepped aside. Without a word, allowing her to enter first, a gesture subtle yet unmistakable in its acknowledgement. Inside, the descent felt different from before, not heavier, not lighter, but more defined, as if each passing floor carried with it the quiet transfer of authority that had already been set into motion, and Evelyn's gaze rested briefly on the mirrored wall, her reflection steady, composed. A presence that no longer needed to prove itself, because the proof had already been secured in ink and intention. When the elevator doors opened into the lobby, the same polished stillness greeted her, but this time the atmosphere felt subtly altered, not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that could be sensed, as if the building itself understood the shift that had just occurred within its upper floors, and the receptionist's eyes followed her with a touch more awareness than before, a recognition that had sharpened without explanation. Outside, the city continued its relentless motion, but within the company she had left behind, something far less visible had begun to move, because on the 32nd floor, in the same boardroom where voices had once dismissed her without consequence, the meeting had not fully dissolved. Conversations had lingered, and Jason Reed stood near the head of the table, his attention divided between closing remarks and the subtle need to reassert control over a room that had momentarily slipped into uncertainty. And as one of the senior executives approached him with a tablet in hand, the interruption seemed routine at first, another update, another detail to manage. But the shift came not in the words themselves, but in the way they were delivered, quieter, more deliberate, the kind of tone that carried weight before meaning was even understood. Jason's expression did not change immediately. His posture remained composed, but there was a pause, a fraction of a second where the rhythm of his confidence faltered, and the room, attuned to his movements, felt it without fully recognizing why. And as he took the tablet, his eyes scanning the screen, the faintest tightening appeared at the corner of his jaw, so slight it could have been dismissed, except that it did not disappear as quickly as it should have. Around him, conversation slowed, glances shifted, the subtle current of attention redirecting itself toward him in a way that suggested something was no longer aligned. And though no one spoke, the silence began to carry a different quality, not empty, but expectant, as if the room itself was waiting for something to be clarified. Outside, unaware of the moment unfolding above, Evelyn stepped onto the sidewalk once more, her pace unhurried, her path already set, and as she moved through the flow of the city, the distance between her and the company grew not just in blocks and intersections, but in understanding, because what had been decided in silence was now beginning to surface, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through the quiet unraveling of a certainty that had never been as secure as it seemed. And somewhere behind her, far above the noise of the street, Jason Reed stood in a room that no longer belonged to him in the way he believed, holding information that had not yet fully reached him, but would, inevitably, in a way that could not be dismissed or undone. The silence in the boardroom did not break all at once. It shifted, like something subtle but irreversible moving beneath the surface. And Jason Reed remained standing at the head of the table, the tablet still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the screen, as if reading the same line more than once might change its meaning. But it did not. And around him the executives who had once followed his rhythm, without question began to exchange glances that were no longer entirely aligned with his. Their confidence no longer anchored in his certainty, but drifting, uncertain, as if the ground beneath them had tilted by just a few degrees. One of them cleared his throat softly, the sound restrained but enough to draw attention. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone careful, neutral, but beneath it there was something else, something that had not been present earlier, a hint of distance. And Jason lowered the tablet slowly, his expression composed, practiced, but the pause before he spoke stretched just long enough to be noticed. "It is a routine update," he said, his voice steady, controlled, the same voice that had carried authority minutes ago. And yet the words did not land with the same weight, because the room had already felt the hesitation, already registered the shift that could not be explained away so easily. Another executive leaned slightly forward, his brow tightening. "From the board?" he asked, and this time Jason did not answer immediately, his gaze flickering briefly back to the screen before he placed the tablet on the table with A measured motion, the soft contact echoing faintly in the quiet. And for the first time since the meeting had begun, he did not fill the silence right away, as if calculating not just what to say, but how much of the truth had already begun to surface. Outside, the city continued without interruption, and Evelyn Carter moved through it with the same quiet composure, unaware not of what was happening, but of the exact moment it would unfold, because timing, she had learned, did not need to be controlled down to the second, only set into motion with precision, and she stepped into another building, smaller, less imposing, but no less significant, where a receptionist greeted her with immediate recognition, her tone shifting from polite to purposeful. "They are expecting you upstairs," she said, and Evelyn nodded once, her movements unhurried, as if the urgency belonged to others, not to her. Back in the boardroom, the atmosphere tightened further, the subtle current of unease growing stronger, and one of the senior partners reached for the tablet Jason had set down, his movements cautious but deliberate, and Jason did not stop him, did not reach for it again, and that, more than anything, was what changed the room, because control, once relinquished even slightly, altered everything. And as the partner's eyes scanned the screen, his expression shifted in a way that could not be masked, not shock, not disbelief, but something closer to realization, the kind that arrives quietly but lands with unmistakable weight. And when he finally looked up, his gaze moved not just to Jason, but across the room, as if recalibrating every assumption that had been made just moments before. "This was approved this morning?" he asked, his voice lower now, more deliberate. And Jason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the answer already evident in the silence that followed. And for a brief moment, no one spoke. The room suspended in a space between what had been believed and what was beginning to emerge. And somewhere within that silence, the first fracture became undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Because the information in that tablet was not speculation, not rumor, it was fact, and facts did not ask for permission to be acknowledged. Far below, moving steadily through her own sequence of meetings and confirmations, Evelyn continued forward without pause, her path already defined, her role already secured, and though no one in that boardroom spoke her name yet, though the connection had not fully formed in their minds, it was only a matter of moments before it would, and when it did, it would not come as a question, but as an answer they had not prepared for. The silence did not shatter, it tightened, pulling every person in the boardroom into a stillness that felt heavier than any confrontation. And the senior partner holding the tablet lowered it slowly onto the table, as if the weight of the information had transferred into his hands, his gaze no longer drifting but fixed, deliberate, moving from Jason Reed to the others as though recalculating a structure they had all accepted without question. "This is not a routine update," he said finally, his voice calm but stripped of its earlier ease, and the words settled into the room with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. And Jason remained standing, his posture still composed, but there was something different now, something less certain in the way his shoulders held, as if the balance he relied on had shifted just enough to be felt, but not yet fully understood. Another executive reached for the document summary displayed on the screen, his fingers moving with a controlled urgency, scanning the lines that confirmed what none of them had anticipated. And as his eyes moved across the text, the realization formed not in shock, but in quiet recognition, the kind that arrives when the truth has already been decided elsewhere. "Controlling stake, finalized this morning," he read under his breath, the words barely audible but enough to ripple through the room. And someone else leaned forward, their chair shifting slightly against the polished floor. "Who approved this?" The question came, not sharp, not accusatory, but searching, and the answer did not come from Jason. It came from the document itself, from the signatures and timestamps that left no room for ambiguity. For a moment, no one spoke, the air suspended between what they had believed and what now stood in front of them. And then, almost inevitably, the next question surfaced, quieter but far more precise. "Who is the new majority owner?" And this time, the silence stretched longer. Because the answer existed, it was there, written clearly, but acknowledging it required something more than reading. It required acceptance. Jason's gaze shifted back to the tablet, his expression controlled, but the stillness around his eyes gave him away, the faint tightening that had begun minutes ago now settling into something more permanent, and he did not reach for the device again, did not reclaim it. As if doing so would confirm a loss of control, he was not ready to concede. The senior partner inhaled slowly, his eyes moving once more across the document before lifting, and when he spoke, his voice carried no hesitation, only the weight of fact. "Evelyn Carter," he said, and the name did not echo loudly. It did not need to. It landed with a precision that cut through every assumption that had filled the room earlier that day. Across the table, reactions did not explode. They shifted, subtle but unmistakable, a straightening of posture, a recalibration of attention, the quiet recognition that the person they had dismissed hours ago now occupied a position none of them could ignore, and Jason remained still, his expression unchanged at a glance. But beneath it, something had fractured, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be reversed, because the narrative he had built no longer aligned with the reality that had just been spoken aloud. Outside, the city carried on without pause, and somewhere within it, Evelyn Carter stepped into yet another room where her presence was met not with doubt, but with certainty, and as conversations began to shift on the 32nd floor, as roles and assumptions quietly realigned, the truth settled fully into place, not announced with force, not argued into existence, but stated once, clearly, and left to stand on its own, and in that moment, everything that had been said about her earlier that day lost its meaning. Because worth was no longer something to be debated, it had already been decided. The name did not echo, but it lingered, settling into every corner of the boardroom with a quiet finality that no one could ignore, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, as if even the smallest reaction might confirm something they were not yet ready to fully accept, and Jason Reed remained standing at the head of the table, his posture still composed. But the illusion of control that had surrounded him earlier now felt thinner, stretched across a reality that had already shifted beyond his reach. Across from him, the senior partner adjusted his stance slightly, his attention no longer deferential, no longer aligned, but measured, recalibrated, as though reassessing not just the situation, but Jason himself, and others followed, subtle changes in posture, in eye contact, in the direction of their attention, small movements that collectively altered the balance of the room, without a single word being raised. "We should verify the details," someone said, though the tone lacked conviction, because the document had already done that, the signatures, the timestamps, the structure of the acquisition leaving no ambiguity, and the question hung there not as a challenge, but as a delay, a brief attempt to slow what had already been set into motion. Jason's gaze moved once more to the tablet, then away, his jaw tightening slightly as he exhaled through his nose, a controlled gesture, practiced, but insufficient, to restore what had been lost in the space of a single name. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried a different weight now, less command, more calculation. "There must be additional context," he said, as if context could reshape ownership, as if explanation could undo what had already been finalized. And no one immediately responded, because the room no longer required his interpretation to understand the situation. Outside, the city remained indifferent, and Evelyn Carter stepped into a quiet office overlooking a different stretch of skyline, where the noise of Midtown softened into distance, and a small group of advisors stood as she entered, their movements immediate, respectful, their focus clear, and as she took her place near the window, the light catching briefly against the glass behind her, there was no need for introduction, no need for confirmation, because everything that needed to be known had already been decided, and as one of them handed her a summary of the next steps, she reviewed it with the same calm precision, her attention steady, her movements unhurried, as if the outcome had never been in question. Back in the boardroom, the silence began to shift again, not breaking, but evolving, as conversations started to form in quieter tones, executives leaning toward one another, voices lowered, recalibrating strategies, recalibrating alliances. And though Jason remained at the head of the table, the room no longer revolved around him in the same way. The center had moved, invisibly but unmistakably, and he could feel it, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual withdrawal of certainty, the kind that leaves nothing obvious to fight against, nothing dramatic to resist, only a series of realizations that could not be undone. When was this executed? Another voice asked, more directly now, and the answer came from the same place as before, from the document, from the facts that did not require interpretation. This morning, the senior partner replied, his tone steady, and the words settled into the room with quiet authority, confirming what had already been understood. And for the first time, no one looked to Jason for confirmation, no one waited for him to respond, because the answer no longer belonged to him. Far from that room, Evelyn lowered the document in her hand, her gaze lifting to the city beyond the glass. Her reflection faint but steady, and there was no smile, no outward sign of victory, only a stillness that carried more weight than any reaction could. Because she had not returned to reclaim what was lost, she had returned to redefine it entirely. And somewhere behind her, in a room that had once dismissed her without consequence, the realization continued to unfold, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that could not be ignored and would not be reversed. The room did not erupt, it recalibrated, and that was what made it irreversible, because no one argued with the fact that had just been spoken. No one raised their voice or demanded clarification beyond what was already written in the document. Instead, the shift unfolded in silence, in the way chairs were adjusted, in the way eyes no longer returned to Jason Reed for direction, in the way conversations began to form around him rather than with him, and he stood there still, at the head of the table that no longer felt like his hands resting lightly against the polished surface as if maintaining contact with it might preserve something that had already slipped beyond his control. Across from him, the senior partner closed the tablet with a quiet finality, placing it flat on the table as though setting down a conclusion rather than a device. And when he spoke again, his tone carried a different alignment, not dismissive, not confrontational, but repositioned. We will need to prepare for a transition briefing, he said. And the word transition settled into the room with more weight than any accusation could have, because it implied movement, change, an acknowledgement that the structure they had operated within was no longer fixed. Jason's gaze lifted slowly, his expression composed, but the space around him had already shifted, the subtle current of authority redirecting itself away from him. And for the first time since the meeting had begun, no one waited for him to respond. No one looked to him to frame what came next, because the next step had already been defined elsewhere. Has she contacted anyone directly? Another executive asked, his voice quieter now, measured, and the question carried something new within it. Not dismissal, not skepticism, but recognition. As if the name they had heard had already begun to reshape their understanding of everything that had preceded it, and the answer came. Not with speculation, but with calm certainty. Not yet, the senior partner replied, but she does not need to. And the statement lingered, because it was true, because authority at that level did not require introduction, it required only acknowledgement. Outside that room, in a different space where light filtered softly across glass and steel, Evelyn Carter stood near the window, her attention resting not on the city below, but on the document in her hand, the final summary of what had already been executed. And as she closed it with a quiet motion, one of her advisors stepped slightly closer. The board will expect direction, he said, his tone respectful, precise, and Evelyn inclined her head just enough to acknowledge the statement, her gaze steady. They will have it, she replied, her voice calm, even, carrying no urgency because none was required. And as she turned slightly, the reflection in the glass aligned with her movement, a composed figure framed against a city that had no awareness of the shift unfolding within it. Back in the boardroom, the realization continued to settle, not as a shock, but as a quiet inevitability, and Jason exhaled slowly, his posture adjusting by the smallest degree, not in surrender, not yet, but in recognition that the framework he had relied on had changed, and though no one said it aloud, though no one addressed him directly, the absence of deference spoke louder than anything else, because power, once moved, did not need to announce itself. It simply occupied a different space, leaving everything else to adjust around it. And in that moment, without confrontation, without spectacle, the balance had shifted completely. not with noise, but with silence that carried more authority than any words ever could. The boardroom did not return to what it had been. It settled into something quieter, more precise, as if every person inside it had adjusted to a new center of gravity without needing to acknowledge the shift out loud. And Jason Reed remained where he stood for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the table, his gaze no longer fixed on any one point, but moving, recalculating, searching for a position that no longer existed in the way it had before. And when he finally stepped back, the movement was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it marked the first visible acknowledgement that the room no longer moved with him at its center. Conversations resumed, but not around him. Instead, they formed in quieter clusters, executives leaning toward one another, voices measured, deliberate, already adjusting language, already shifting tone, because alignment at that level was instinctive, and the absence of certainty had already been replaced by a new one, even if it had not yet been fully introduced. The senior partner gathered the documents with calm efficiency, his posture steady, his focus forward. "We will await further instruction," he said, not to Jason, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself, and the statement landed with quiet authority because it acknowledged what no one needed explained anymore. Outside, the city moved as it always did, traffic flowing, people crossing streets, unaware that within a single building, power had changed hands without spectacle. And in a quiet office above a different skyline, Evelyn Carter stood near the window, her reflection steady in the glass, the faint outline of the city layered behind her like a backdrop that no longer defined her position. And she turned slightly as one of her advisors approached with a finalized schedule, placing it gently on the table beside her. "The board is ready when you are," he said, his tone respectful, direct, and Evelyn glanced at the document briefly, not to confirm, but to acknowledge. Because readiness had never been the question, she moved toward the door with the same composed cadence she had carried all morning, her steps unhurried, her posture steady, and as she walked, there was no anticipation in her expression, no trace of what had been said about her just hours earlier, because that version of her no longer existed in any space that mattered. And as the door opened ahead of her, the transition was seamless, not dramatic, not marked by announcement, but by presence alone. Back on the 32nd floor, the boardroom had emptied, but the echo of the moment remained, not in sound, but in understanding, and Jason stood alone for a brief second, his reflection faint in the glass wall, the skyline stretching beyond him in a way that now felt distant, untethered, and he exhaled slowly, the controlled composure still intact, but no longer reinforced by the room around him, because the room had already moved on, and somewhere between those two spaces, between the silence he was left with, and the certainty she stepped into, the story completed itself without needing to be spoken, because she had not returned to argue, not to prove, not to reclaim anything that had been taken. She had simply become something that could not be dismissed, and as the doors closed behind her, the final shift settled into place, quiet, irreversible, and complete, because in the end, she did not respond to what he had called her. She replaced it with something the world could no longer ignore.